Hello, and welcome to this week's From the Vault episode from the Magdalen House podcast. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in Dallas, Texas, and affectionately known by many as Maggies. Every first and third Wednesday, we bring you a new release. In our From the Vault episodes, we share past podcast releases from our 3 different podcast series: RecoverED, RecoverED, Interviews with Alcoholics, and Hope for the Family. Our podcast aims to connect, inspire, and educate alcoholics, loved ones, and the community to the Magdalen House and the services we offer. We are glad you're here, and thank you for listening.
Today, we're going to have Chloe wrap up the series studying the steps with us on step 12. If you have not heard Chloe yet, you are in for a treat. So take it away, Chloe, on step 12.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'm an alcoholic. My name is Chloe. My sobriety date is July 7th, 1992, and I am the director of programs at the Magdalen House. I have a home group. I have a sponsor. She has a sponsor, and I am a sponsor. And, you know, one of the funny things about step 12 that I was thinking about is that, like, as a sponsor, I have spent a whole lot of time reading doctor's opinion with people. Those first handful of chapters in the book, you know, we get the opportunity to go over a lot with new people. It is, you know, a lot less frequent that I have the opportunity to go through these later chapters with people. And it just, you know, is the sad facts with alcoholism. You know, we just, you know, staying sober, you know, it's not a guarantee. It requires a lot of work, and there's a lot of work that happens between step 1 and step 12. So that being said, let's start with what step 12 actually is. I always like to start with that because a lot of times people, you know, you may not know. So in how it works, starting on 59, it goes through what our steps actually are. Step 12 is actually on the flip page on page 60. And so our 12th step is having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. We tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. And a lot of times, you know, that gets broken down to just be, you know, helping others. And that's not really, you know, I mean, that is what step 12 is, but that leaves out a lot. So I just kind of want to break down what this actually says to begin with. And so in that step, it talks about, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics. And so the question is, what is the message that we're carrying to alcoholics? What is this message? This message is what the first part of that sentence says: having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. It's not a result of the steps. It's not one of the things that we get by doing the steps. It's the result of the steps. It's what we get. We get this spiritual awakening. And so that's the message that we're carrying to others. We are carrying the message that if you do these steps, you will be awakened spiritually. And so, you know, in truth, we can't really carry a message until we've had that spiritual awakening. That doesn't mean we can't be helpful. That doesn't mean that we can't, you know, give rides or give words of hope or be, you know, a closed-mouthed friend or, you know, all of those things. But we can't effectively carry a message that we don't have. And, you know, we have this spiritual awakening by the 12th step. And so that's, you know, as a sponsor, that's my job, is to prepare the women that I work with to be sponsors. You know, I always like to start with the idea that, you know, if anything I say this morning can't be reconciled in the big book, ignore it. And if it's in conflict with what your sponsor tells you, do what she says. You know, I'm not in here trying to, you know, take her place. I'm just here to tell you my experience with this stuff. And I know that everybody has their own little ways of doing things differently. So, you know, I'm just here to talk about my experience, and I welcome any and all questions. So if at any point you want to ask me something, just jump in. Okay, so we're carrying the message that we have had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. So that's the first part of this. The first time when I first went through the steps, and then I got to step 12 and my sponsor says, you know, like, now you're ready to sponsor other people. I did not feel ready to sponsor other people. It felt like this huge, you know, responsibility. I thought that for sure I was going to kill people. I was going to say the wrong thing. Everybody was going to drink and die. You know, like it felt like this huge, I just felt really underqualified, you know, and this step reminds me that the only thing I need to do is have had an experience with these 12 steps, and then to sit down and share that experience with the new person. That's it. I don't have to have, a PhD in psychology. I don't have to have had the same story as the woman that I'm working with. We can have completely different stories. We can come from really different backgrounds. All I have to have is that experience and, the commitment to sharing that experience with the new woman. Because again, like I have had, I don't know why this story is coming to mind, but I'm going to share it since it did. When I first moved to Texas about 8 years ago, a girl that I sponsored from New Hampshire, her name was Amy. She called me and she was freaking out. She was sponsoring this new woman named Kaylin, who had been in and out for years. She could never get more than a few days sober. And Kaylin at this point was 2 weeks sober. And that was like a miracle, And the night before, Amy and Kaylin and a whole bunch of women were doing what we do. They had all gotten into Amy's car and driven to Boston to go to an AA meeting. They were, experiencing fellowship and community and just, the real, the gifts of this program that we get, which is this, this group of women. And while they were there, Kaylin's boyfriend was driving his car with her 7-year-old daughter in the backseat. A drunk driver hit him and he was killed instantly, and her daughter was on life support. About a week later, she had to make the decision to pull the plug on her 7-year-old daughter. Kaylin was 2 weeks sober, and she's still sober today. That girl could not get 3 days sober, and she had something happen to her, which I think, I always had this lurking notion in the back of my head that if something happened to my kids, I wouldn't be able to stay sober through it. These little things that God's not big enough to help me if this happens, if it ever gets that bad. So on one hand, I got to watch Kaylin walk through this horrific experience and stay sober through it. I got to watch the women of Alcoholics Anonymous and her sponsorship family just circle around her. They spent those days in the hospital while her daughter was on life support, and they just loved her through it. And sometimes that's all we have to do. Amy, her sponsor, felt completely unqualified, totally unqualified to be able to help in this situation, which of course she was, just like I would be. She didn't have to have that shared experience. All she had to have was love and, just to keep praying and to keep reaching out to other people so that she was getting support. But really, this is just about love, right? This is just about love and being there for each other and showing up for each other. And this is way out of order, but on page 133 in the Family Afterward, it is, one of my favorite parts of the book. The very top of the page, it says, "We are sure that God wants us to be happy, joyous, and free. We cannot subscribe to the belief that this life is a vale of tears, though it once was just that for many of us. But it is clear that we made our own misery. God didn't do it. Avoid then the deliberate manufacture of misery. But if trouble comes, cheerfully capitalize it as an opportunity to demonstrate his omnipotence." And, life happens. Life does not stop happening just because we get sober, and hard things continue to happen. And what we get to do is we get to rely on this God that we've now developed a relationship with. We get to use that fellowship that we've had grow up around us. And, when we get to the other side of it, we get to see all of the evidence of God in that hard time. And it's the best demonstration of the real miracle that we get here. I've talked a lot here with you all about the divorce that I went through a year ago, and how I want God to demonstrate his omnipotence in my life is through shiny things. Like I want my kid is an honors student sticker on the back of my car. I want the house on the hill. I want the tiara. I want to be carried everywhere I go. I want, you to be able to say, wow, God loves her so much that she has this blessed life, like nothing bad happens to her. And that's how God demonstrates his love. And that's not true. Life is life. And there's the normal, the book talks about the vicissitudes, the normal ups and downs of life, and stuff happens. And there is no better demonstration of God's omnipotence than everything falling apart and being able to survive it, being able to walk through it, which is the second part of that step, which is practicing these principles in all our affairs, even when things are hard, even when the other person is more to blame, even when we don't want to get out of bed, we are practicing these principles in all our affairs, and God is demonstrating through us just what he can do. And, I know that as I was going through this, really painful time in my life, people said to me what I have said to other people, which is, you're going to be able to use this to help others. And my response was, F that. I don't care about other people that much. I would rather just be happy. Knowing all along that, of course, I would get to the other side of that. But in the moment, it doesn't feel worth it. In the moment, I just want to be okay all the time. I just want to feel God's bounty and his love and his sunshine. And, it's like in those moments, I want the God of karma. I'm doing all of this good stuff. I'm, helping others. I pay my taxes. I mostly stick by the speed limit unless I'm really late, and then I don't. But, and so what I want is that God of karma that then only gives me good things. And that's just not how it works. This is life. When I'm in the middle of it, I don't get to see what it's going to look like on the other side. And so that's where this faith comes in, because the truth is, where I sit today, a year later, I am so grateful for all of those things that were torn out of my life, even though they were just, the worst thing ever at the time. The life that I have today is so much better than it was a year and a half ago. And I couldn't have known that. I couldn't have expected that. We practice these principles in all our affairs, even when we don't want to. So those are really the two parts of step 12. We have working with others, which, is all about carrying the message. And, I sort of feel like I'll probably just mostly tell stories this morning, because we have these 3 chapters, between the family afterwards, vision for you, and working with others, which there's so much stuff in that. And I'm happy to pull things out of it. But, we're talking about carrying this message, after having done the first 11 steps. We've now entered the world of the spirit, and our job is to carry this message to the people that are sick and suffering. And so how do we do that, right? When I was first getting sober, and there's still tons of 12-step work. Like, I don't want to pretend like back in the old days when I got sober, it was so different than it is now. I lived in a cardboard box in the middle of the road. My experience then was really different than my experience today. I was, my phone number was in our little local CSO office, and I would get 12-step calls, and I would, grab another, recovered friend, and we would go out to a trailer in the woods and sit and, talk to a drunk woman who was, dying. And I got, a lot of those experiences in the early days. And I don't know if it was just, then I don't know what's changed. I think, treatment is a lot more available today than it used to be. I think the insurance industry has changed a lot of that. But it's really rare that I get to meet a woman today who hasn't been to treatment, who hasn't been in and out of AA for years. It does happen sometimes, but today, our local intergroup office has something called Night Watch. And I think you have to maybe have a year or 2 sober to be part of that. But it is the same thing. My phone number is, listed there, and I sign up to volunteer to take phone calls at night. And so, I do get that opportunity. It is different. It looks different today, but we have so many chances to carry this message. Whether it's going into treatment centers, going into detoxes, going into jails. And my first suggestion to the women that I sponsor is to have a home group. If we start with having a home group and having a service position at that home group, that's generally where we find these opportunities to carry the message into facilities. When I was first getting sober, I was in Tucson, Arizona. There was really strong recovery there. And I was able to just sort of be this baby. I could just be this kid in AA and not have to really, take responsibility. I could just kind of show up at meetings. And when I moved to, but I knew what the message was. I knew what was the solution to alcoholism. And so when I moved to Maine, I wasn't finding that. And, that fellowship that grows up around us that I had experienced in Tucson, I wasn't finding it in Maine. And if anybody has moved in sobriety, I've done it a bunch of times, and it's always hard. We don't like change a lot of times, and it takes a while to establish that new community. And so I moved to Maine, and they weren't doing it right there. I didn't like their AA. I felt like it was, middle of the road. There wasn't a lot of solution. The old timers were so crusty and miserable. And They would say things like, if your ass falls off, you put it in a bag and take it to a meeting. Meetings were the solution to everything. And I was so obnoxious. I would basically carry my little soapbox into every meeting, and I would do these drive-bys. I would wait until, somebody said something that was, middle of the road, and I would just fire off right after them. And I'm this kid, with 9 months sober. No, I guess I had a year and a half sober. And I was on a mission, and my motives were good, but I wasn't showing, patience, tolerance, and love. I would wait till they spoke, and then I would fire off you're killing people. The solution is God. It's not, going to a meeting. And needless to say, I didn't make a lot of friends. The message I was carrying was not very attractive. This is about attraction, not promotion. And I was all about promoting the 12 steps because I knew people are dying, and that's the truth here, guys. People are dying, and they need the message of Alcoholics Anonymous, but the way that we carry it is going to make the difference between whether they can hear it from us or not. And so I had a period of growth that had to happen. One of the first things I did was I became a home group member at that crusty meeting where people would say, I do all 12 steps every morning before I get out of bed. These people, honestly, they had never done a 4-step. I feel very comfortable taking their inventory in that. But the truth was, they had 20 plus years sober and they were doing something right. I didn't want what they had, but, it wasn't my place to be in there judging people for what was different than what I was doing. And so I became a home group member there, and I was given the key to the church, and I was made the coffee maker. I did setup every week, and it saved my life. I was miserable in Maine in a lot of ways. I don't know if I would have kept going to those meetings because they just weren't feeding me in the way that I wanted them to. I'm so selfish. I want to go. I want to take. I want to be filled up. I want to hear a message. And I wasn't getting that. But by having that key, I had to show up every week. I had to be the first one there. I had to unlock that door. I had to make the coffee, and I had to start getting to know people's names, even when I didn't want to. And I'd be, sort of unbeknownst to me, that's what pulled me into AA in Maine. And from there, I felt like that group was home, even though I wouldn't have picked it, and I learned how to carry a message that wasn't making somebody else wrong. I just shared my experience with these 12 steps. And when I wasn't saying what you're doing wrong and that you're killing people, I could just say, here's what I did. Here's what step 1 was for me. And I ended up, getting a lot of sponsees that way. And that was my first experience sponsoring. I was a year and a half sober, and I was finally growing up in AA and taking some responsibility. And I was terrified. I was terrified to sponsor. Again, like I said in the beginning, I was sure that I was going to kill people. So much of being a sponsor is being sponsored, and having that relationship with my sponsor, who I could keep going back to saying, now what do I do? I will say there is nothing like being a sponsor to keep you moving through your own recovery. It's I had to, get super busy in my amends, because all of my amends were back in Maine, or most of them. And I hadn't had a chance to make them because I was living out on the West Coast. And so I got busy in amends because I knew I couldn't tell people to do things that I wasn't doing myself. I was told that my 5th step wasn't complete until I listened to somebody else's 5th step, and so one of the girls from those early days, is now 26 years sober. And that's what we get here. I mean, I'm sort of all over the place, but, I think that, I think back to those days with Karen Ann, and talk about being out of my league. She was suicidal. She was so depressed. That was outside of the scope of what I had to offer. I mean, I definitely suffered from depression. I understood that, but I don't need to be a psychotherapist. I don't need to be a psychologist. I don't need to have any degrees in anything. I just keep bringing it back to the 12 steps. And I can say that, I don't know how to help you with that. That's an outside issue. What I can help you with is getting through this 4th step, or, whatever it is. I really have to make sure that I'm not stepping into areas that I have no business in, and I do have a lot of experience with different things that, they're really outside issues, and I'm not going to go into them, but talk to your sponsor once you start sponsoring about sponsoring people on medications. And, that's something I had to learn about. And, I love how the big book goes through all of these very specific ways to carry this message. Don't be a nursemaid to other people's sprees. like it goes through this whole thing of like, we may have to fight a man, they may burn a mattress, and there are some crazy things that happen when we're working with newcomers. And we have to like go through all of those hard times for the, occasion when we get to watch somebody stay sober and get recovered and get their kids back, and watch their families, return, and watch, their careers happen, and, watch their lives unfold. And, it is an absolute miracle. Honestly, that's where I learned about God, was from watching people that were hopeless, watching people who had no power to do better in their lives, and getting to see this transformation happen. And I knew that it was bigger than them. I had we have our own experiences, but watching it happen for somebody else is completely different. Getting to watch that light come on, watch God enter their lives, and watch the 12 steps create this complete psychic change. There was no denying it for me. And, it really is like that's where I see God's love and God's power, is through his kids. And, Polly talks about, we don't shoot our wounded here. And that's, being a sponsor is where I learned how to be a grown-up. I learned how to have compassion for people who kept burning their lives to the ground. And, my mom is an active alcoholic and drug addict. And, I could have more love and empathy and patience for the women that I was sponsoring than for my own mother. I could say, oh, they're powerless. It's the best they can do. They're just doing what alcoholics do. And with my mom, I would have this completely different view where I would think she could do better if she wanted to. She obviously just doesn't love me, because if she really loved me, she'd stop drinking. I was like, this was like yesterday. I mean, not really, but, I can still go there. I can still let my emotions create delusion for me. And so sponsoring has taught me, these principles of, of integrity, of honesty, of willingness, being where I say that I'm going to be, doing what I say I'm going to do. Being a sponsor taught me about being that closed mouth friend. I was the worst gossip ever. I couldn't keep a confidence. It's like you would tell me something and I'd be immediately telling other people. I was just untrustworthy. Being a sponsor, I knew that keeping your story safe, that my life depended on it and that your life might depend on it. You had to trust me. And I could not, my husband at the time, a lot of times we would end up sponsoring husband and wives. And there were times that the girl that I was sponsoring gave me really important information that would really help my ex-husband with his guy. Like he could really use that information. My life depended on not giving it. As a sponsor, and I'm talking to you all as, sponsors or potential sponsors, the most important thing that you can do is to keep a confidence. If you do nothing else, that's the most important thing, is that when the women come to you, tell their 5th step, share their 10th steps, that it stays with you. I became a foster parent in sobriety. And when you go through that, you become a mandated reporter. And so, legally I was bound to, if abuse was happening with a child, I had to share it. And so what I would do is, when I first started sponsoring people, I would tell them that. I would say, I'm a mandated reporter. So if there is abuse, don't tell me, because I don't want to be put in the position of, of feeling like I need to tell that. And so, again, talk to your sponsor about all of these things. We're dealing with alcoholics, we're dealing with humans, and it's messy, and, there's always new situations, and, we can't ever be fully prepared for it. So having that sponsor ourselves becomes vitally important, especially when women get to their 9th step and they're considering amends, and, those are really hard. And, I've used my sponsor more in sponsorship with others than just about anything else. Do you guys have any questions about anything that I've said or unrelated?
I have a question. So I know that your experience is like one of the first women that you ever took through the steps and that you ever sponsored is still sober today. Mm-hmm. What would you tell the women who don't have that experience, who feels like everyone they sponsor ends up drinking again?
So she was, probably my 15th sponsee, all 14 before her drank, and probably all 14 after her drank. Some women stayed sober and just stopped going to AA. Like that, the results of it are not we can't get hung up on that. My only job is to, hand you this kit of spiritual tools that's been handed to me. And if people don't stay sober, that's okay. We stay available. I generally, don't stop working with people because they relapse. If they want to keep going through the steps, and keep trying at it, I am here. I don't ever take it personally. I had somebody relapse this last weekend who I've, sponsored for several years now. And it's really sad. And, she was drunk and crying and saying, "Are you going to fire me?" And I said, "Absolutely not. You didn't do this to me. You did what we do." And, it happens. And as a sponsor, I think we always do, get reflective and say, is there something I could have done more? Should I have seen this coming? Should I have said something? But the truth is, this is about their relationship with God. And before I answer the phone, I always say a quick prayer. Before I sit down with a sponsee, I say a prayer. And I just, see myself, I try to see myself as just channeling God and doing the best I can. I mean, it's not my job to get people sober. It's just my job to share my experience with the 12 steps, but that being said, when the phone rings, do I answer it? Or do I let it go to voicemail? Do I make appointments with my sponsees and, keep them moving through the 12 steps? Or am I selfish with my time? I was talking a minute ago about, how I've learned how to be a grown-up through sponsorship. And it's true. I've had sponsees that would cancel over and over and over again, and having to have those, I am such an avoider. I hate uncomfortable conversations. I hate confrontation. I just want you to think that I'm the best all the time. And, having to say to somebody, listen, my time is important, and you've canceled the past 3 times last minute or just not shown up. And, I could be giving that time to somebody else. And, having to be willing to be honest with somebody when I would rather avoid it. That's been one of the gifts of sponsorship, having to be selfless and give of that time that I'd rather be in sweatpants, drinking a cup of coffee, having people at the house at 6:30, 7:30 on a weekend morning. And being grateful for it. I'm not always grateful for it, when I'm getting ready for it. I'll be lying in bed thinking, why did I do this again? And as soon as, they are sitting in my living room and we're having a cup of coffee and we're talking about, the solution to alcoholism, there's no place I'd rather be. I feel so privileged to get invited to be part of people's recovery because, we get to see things that most people don't get to see. We get to be part of, miracles that most people don't get to be part of. And, again, all I have to do is show up, really. This is probably, well, I'm not going to preface this, but one of my favorite things that we talk about is, we can't transmit something we don't have, but we will transmit what we do have. And so if I am not making amends, if I'm not doing 10 steps, if I'm not, doing prayer and meditation and I'm trying to sponsor people, I'm going to see that in my sponsees. I'm not going to be getting nightly sent to me. I've watched it because, my sobriety, my recovery has ebbed and flowed over the years. When I am not recovered, I see it in my sponsees, and so we cannot transmit what we don't have, and we will transmit what we do have. And if I want to be effectively helping others, I need to be recovered. And this is one of the things I was thinking about this morning. When I was a sponsor in the early days, that girl, Karen Ann, actually, I didn't have kids and she had this little, 2.5, 3-year-old daughter named Mia. And I didn't know what it was like to be a mom. And I didn't have a lot of compassion or empathy for the situation she was in. And I would say things like, well, you found a way to get to the bar, didn't you? You need to, you need to make your recovery your priority. And I don't disagree with that. That's not wrong, but I didn't understand just how hard it was for her to arrange things and to manage things with, as a single mom with this baby, and she was broke like we are when we get sober. And I just, I didn't have the compassion that I would later have once I had kids. And I was like, this is really hard. I don't even know how to take a shower and feed myself. And I just didn't get it at the time. And, she would bring little Mia to, we were part of the same home group. It was on Wednesday nights, and she would bring Mia down the stairs and bring a sleeping bag, and she'd put Mia to sleep on the floor in the meeting. And after the meeting, one of the different guys in the home group would carry her in her sleeping bag up to Karen Ann's car and put her in the back seat. And it ended up being this beautiful thing, but I just didn't get it at the time. And so once I became a mom, I was a much better sponsor to other moms. My sponsor at the time, Polly, would say, like, we don't get sober to then just abandon our families. And that's been true for me. Like, it has to become a balance. You hear around here about kitchen AA, and like, what does our recovery look like at home? Am I just like selfishly going to like 3 meetings a day because I need to be fed, and answering the phone 24 hours a day and, neglecting my kids? Or am I finding a balance? And so, one of the things I did when my kids were born, I still had my home group. I still did make it to meetings, but it was way less. AA had been my whole life. And suddenly I have these little people, and I have a sponsee who had 4 little kids. They were just like, 2 years apart. And she would say, God has called me to clothe his naked and feed his hungry. And they just happen to live in my house, and so we find ways of still being of service. And what I would do is on Monday nights, my door was open, and I would make a big pot of spaghetti, and, the girls would pile into my house, and we would eat together, and I'd feed my kids, and I would set them up around the house to write inventory or, their 8-step cards or whatever they were working on, while I went and put my kids in the tub and put them to bed. And then I'd come down and meet with women one after the other in the office. And, at the time, it was like a little bit selfishly motivated because it was just easier for me. It was easier than running all over town, trying to meet up with people at this coffee shop, at that coffee shop with 2 little kids in tow, or trying to find babysitters. And so what worked for me and my family was to open my doors, make spaghetti, and have people over. And later, years later, what I found, 2 of those young women, they were probably 20 years old at the time. Several years went by and they had kids of their own. And I had moved away at this point. And each of them called me and said, now I have kids, and I open my mouth and I hear your voice come out. And what I didn't realize was you were teaching me how to be a sober mom by, having me into your house, sitting at your table with you and your kids, watching you put those babies to sleep. You were showing me how to be a present and sober mom. And like, what a gift, it's like, I just thought that I was trying to make it easy, and what it did was it, became this, I guess, experience that these women got to take forward with them. And, I watched both of those 2 young, girls, now, have families of their own, and they're still, in recovery, and they sponsor women. And, I like to think that they're passing that along. And it's just like, it really is just the best gig on earth we get here. I think especially in COVID, like, I'm watching people that aren't in recovery just so isolated and so alone. And, we still have this giant, vibrant community, this fellowship, this opportunity to still be helpful to people. It just looks a little different than what we're used to. I was a couple of years sober, and I got this opportunity to go move to Istanbul, Turkey. And I lived there for 6 months, and I got to be part of AA there. And it was just the coolest thing. And one of the things that I loved most is my home group members from Maine would call me, and they would send me letters. And, like, I still had that connection. I had, this fellowship in Istanbul, but I had my people back in Maine. I had my home group back in Maine, and it was this safe landing spot that I knew I could pick up the phone and call any of them at any point. It's just huge. It's, this fellowship, this program is based on being there for each other. And it's a really pretty incredible thing. You guys have any more questions?
I'll ask a question. First, I want to say I'm so glad that you touched on Kitchen AA, because one of my Jimmy D, what he says that if you're not working your program at home, you're not working your program at all. Yeah. And I just love that so much. But my next question would be, I know you said you don't shoot your wounded, which I love too. Is there a point where letting a sponsee go or have her own experience with somebody else would be the right decision to make? Or what do you do if a sponsee stops calling? Do you follow up with them? Like, what would be your suggestions around that area?
Well, in some ways, I think that's where the promises of 10 and 11 come in, because every person in every situation is so different. And so it's about like waiting for that inspiration, that intuitive thought. But I would say in general, like some conversations I've had with sponsees in the past is, you are unsponsorable right now. Like, I am your sponsor in name only. You are just doing whatever you want. You are, like, you're not coming to me with anything. It's like, you may think I'm your sponsor, but this isn't what sponsorship is. So like, I generally find that people fire themselves. Like, it's not really on me to say, I won't sponsor you anymore, but I will say, if you drink again, I don't want you to think that you were doing AA and it didn't work. AA does work. The 12 steps do work, but only if you're doing them, only if you are absolutely abandoning yourself to this. And that's not what you are doing. So if and when you drink again, please do not say that this didn't work. So those are more the conversations I'll have rather than I won't sponsor you. I may say like, you seem resistant to take my suggestions. Maybe there's somebody that you can hear better than me, but it's like, I think that the motivation behind it is what's important. It's like, if it's coming from a prideful place where I feel like they're wasting my time or they're just not doing what I think they should do, that's totally different. But if from that place of love, I feel like that there's somebody else that could help them better, that's the conversation I'll have is like, you seem, because, like we're messy people, it's like I've had people basically make me their mom. And I don't know about you guys, but I have a complicated relationship with my mom. And, once somebody can't hear me, and I will say like, if I'm not on your 4th step, you're not being honest. It's like, I belong on your 4th step. And if you can't share that piece of inventory with me, that's fine. But you need to share it with somebody, because I think every sponsor I've had has been on my 4 steps or on my nightlies or on my 10th steps, because my sponsor generally doesn't tell me what I want to hear. And so, but with sponsees, if it gets to a place where they either have so many resentments against me, or they only hear their mom every time I open my mouth, or we're just not clicking, or they need something different, it's not about me. I've been quote unquote fired plenty of times. And if any of you are in the position of wanting to change sponsors, don't worry about your sponsor's feelings. Like, I never want my, I usually tell my sponsees, like, this doesn't have to be forever. Like, let's get through the 12, if at any point this stops working for you, please just find somebody else. And so, I think that that's important, that, again, this is all just about helping somebody else. And if I'm not the one to help them, that's okay. I want them to get whatever help they can from whoever they can hear it from. Is that what you were looking for?
Yes. I like the not sponsorable.
Yeah. Oh, I've been totally unsponsorable multiple times. I know what I'm doing. I got this. But back to the kitchen AA though, like there's so many parts of that. And that, like, really what that is that's that second part of step 12 about practicing these principles in all our affairs, which we spend most of our time at home. And if I'm being kind and loving to people in AA, if I'm showing up with patience, kindliness, love, tolerance in my home group, but I'm going home and yelling at my kids and snapping at my partner and, cheating on my taxes, then like, I am not practicing these principles. All I'm doing is faking it when other people are watching. The people that I love most should be getting the best side of me. And, and I only say that because that hasn't been the truth for me. I remember my daughter, Quincy, was a giant handful. She was a really, really hard kid. My mom would say she was just like I was at that age, just so challenging. And I would lose my mind on her. I never laid a hand on her. I was always against spanking and that stuff. But I can do damage with my words, or with the tone of voice I use, or with being unpredictable. One day being patient. The next day, the smallest thing setting me off. And for a little kid, that's horrible. And I remember, apologizing to her for raising my voice or whatever I had done. And she said, I think she was probably like 4 or 5 years old. And she said, "Mom, you always say you're sorry. Why don't you stop doing it?" That was like a knife to my heart. I was sober years at that point, and I knew it was true. Saying I'm sorry that's not the solution. Changing my actions is the solution. If I'm hurting the people that I love the most, then there's something wrong with my spiritual condition. Another thing, sort of back to what I was talking about a little bit ago about balance and about, being there for my family. Date night was a really important thing for me. It's like back then we would make Tuesday nights date night, and my sponsees knew, like, don't call me on Tuesday nights unless you're dying. But, they had lots of other phone calls. Tuesday night was the night that I dedicated to my relationship and being present there. And, and if I was reading a book to my kids, I read the book to my kids, it was important, and it still is important, that my family has me too. That there is a balance, and there's a way to do both well. And I don't always get it right, but it's important to me that my family get the best side of me, and my sponsees also get the best side of me. And, being able to be present for whoever I'm with at that moment is really important. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question, Chloe.
Sure.
Hi, Susan, alcoholic. Back when you were talking about carrying the message and starting with your home group and stuff, do you have any advice or suggestions for the time we're in right now? I have a home group, but anything that can be done in the form of service is already being done. And there's everything's on Zoom. There's nobody in the building. There's nothing to do. And I've been looking outside of my home group to do things. So do you have any suggestions or something about that?
Well, I think we're in weird times right now, right? It's, sort of unprecedented. And, I think some of the things that I've found to be really helpful is to make sure that I have people's phone numbers, and I call them and I check on them. I don't go and just talk about myself. And I try to remember, I try to be mindful. Like you were talking in the meeting last week about that, this really hard thing that was going to happen this week. How'd that go? And so sometimes it's just about, I may not be able to make the coffee at my home group, but I can pick up the phone and check on people. We can still sponsor over Zoom if people can't meet with us in person. We can share meetings on Zoom. Like there's, and if your home group, if all positions are filled, just keep making yourself available. Put your name and your phone number in the chat for sponsorship if you're able to sponsor. And if you're not, you can put your name and your phone number in the chat. Just, if anybody needs support or needs a, friend, we can just kind of be stewards of God's love and just kind of, showing up for people, because, I don't know about you, but I'm really good at just getting trapped in my own busy little life and forgetting to think about other people as my day gets going. And I think, that's sometimes the best stuff we can do is just, take those 5 minutes, at lunch and, go through our list of people and just shoot a couple of texts. Hey, thinking about you. I know this was the anniversary of your dad's death, just being mindful, being loving, and just reaching out to the people around us. I think that we may not, it looks different right now, but, at the end of the day, it's just about human contact and, and offering love.
Thank you.
Of course. We're almost out of time. Does anybody have any questions before we wrap up? I never think I'll be able to use a whole hour. I just don't know how it happens.
There was a lot of good stuff that was said on, Chloe. Thank you very much.
Of course. Well, step 12 is a fun one. Because this is the stuff that we do for the rest of our lives, and I don't know about you guys, but when I was drinking, I had nothing to offer anybody. I just didn't. It was all about me all the time. It was all in my family. Everybody was always so concerned about what was happening with Chloe. Is Chloe okay? Is she, safe? Is she, the phone would ring, and I know my mom's heart would drop to see which Chloe was going to be on the other side of that phone. And being able to be awakened spiritually, what we get is we get to not be that source of drama and conflict and chaos for the people in our lives. We get to be the source of serenity and sanity and, support for those people. And, when I call my mom now, it's never about what's wrong with me. It's always about, how are you doing? What do you need? And I think that, it's that constant thought of others, it's like we finally have something real to offer other people. Like I have this real solution, it's like, and that's amazing. Like I have this way out, that has saved my life, and I am such a believer in it. And all I have to do is offer that to other people. And if they pick it up, great. If they don't, that's okay too. We don't have a monopoly on God, but being able to have a real purpose in life is something that I never expected. And it's, just this amazing byproduct of these 12 steps. I think that's it out of me.
Thank you very much, Chloe. And thank you everybody who is here today. If you think of any questions later, feel free to call me. And if I don't have the answer, I will get them from Chloe. Y'all have a great day.
Thank you.
Hi guys. Thanks for being here with me this morning.
We hope you've enjoyed this From the Vault re-release of the Magdalen House podcast. Tune in every first and third Wednesday for a new release from one of our 3 podcast series. To learn more about the Magdalen House and the services that we offer, visit magdalenhouse.org or follow us on your favorite social media channel by searching for the Magdalen House.